We're running into a new problem now, and we don't fully understand it. Over the last 5 years, and especially the last 3 years, we've become aware of how plastics are penetrating everywhere into the marine ecosystem. Microplastics, especially, and that is a problem. And it's a problem for two reasons. One, many of the plastics that we use are inherently toxic to varying degrees, depending upon which plastic it is. But also, those plastic particles, because they're light, they rise to the surface of the ocean. And few people are aware of the fact that the surface of the ocean is a place where oils from dead fish accumulate. Oils rise to the surface. And those oils concentrate things like persistent organic pollutants. As the plastic rolls around in it, the plastic gathers those persistent organic pollutants out of that surface film and can concentrate it by a factor of 100,000 times or more compared to the water column. When we eat fish that have been eating those plastics, we, by definition, are eating some of the persistent organic pollutants or the inherently toxic elements of plastics that are that have found their way to the surface.
One of my main areas of interest is to make people aware of where they're getting exposure to a lot of chemicals and what they can do to start to avoiding those. They're not going to be able to 100% free from any kind of contact with anything that's toxic. But if we can really understand where some of the major pathways and the major places where this happens, then we can start to figure out how do we minimize that. That, I think, is really critical. Things like, can linings and register receipts and CDs and other things. I mean, things like Gore-Tex. These are all things that can get absorbed into our bodies and cause problems.
The whole issue of food packaging materials is very poorly appreciated. That's, in fact, where we may be one of the biggest sources of exposure that we have to not just plastics, but also inks and other chemicals that are used in the plastic to make the product for packaging.
Some of our plastics contain plasticizers that we know are really potent endocrine disruptors. This is the class of chemicals called phthalates. And so if you, for example, have a rubber ducky, it's essentially a polyvinyl chloride plastic that's made soft and squishy by absorbing phthalates into it. And so when you throw one of these away, you're getting a chemical that is very clear impacts male reproductive health. And that's now in the mix in the water, etc., that's coming out of landfills. If the rubber ducky sails off from Los Angeles out into the Pacific Ocean, any microorganisms that choose to grow on it are going to accumulate phthalates.
A lot of this field of endocrine disruptions started in animals. We started to see these warning signs of different phenotypes, adverse health effects that were associated with chemical spills, chemical exposures, things like that. And then when you looked in the human population, it gave you a target, it gave you something unanticipated, it gave you a direction to go. And without having studied that environment, we never would have been able to see those effects recapitulated in humans.
So plastic can get into the food chain in a variety of ways. In the most simple way, plastic trash ends up in the ocean and it gets consumed by various animals. The animals get consumed by other animals. And it isn't, so the plastic itself can be toxic, right? For example, birds and fish see it as food and they eat it and they get full, but it doesn't get digested and they starve to death. Would be one thing. They get choked. You see pictures of birds choked by various kinds of plastics. More insidiously, the plastics, when they start to break down inside the body, many of them contain chemicals that we call endocrine disrupting chemicals that act on hormonal systems in the body that affect how our bodies develop and function. And then the chemicals become contaminated in, for example, fish. We eat those fish, and then the contamination is passed on to us. And because hormone receptors are quite similar across vertebrate species, they will have similar kinds of effects in humans and in our pets.
60% of bisphenol A is used to make bisphenol A polycarbonate. Those polycarbonate goods then go to a landfill. In the landfill, that polycarbonate transforms back into bisphenol A very slowly over time. And then when it rains on the landfill, you end up with astronomical concentrations of bisphenol A in the leachate. In some cases, that leachate is intercepted and treated. In some cases, it goes straight into the ground and surface waters, which is shocking. But when we treat that, eventually it makes its way often into a municipal wastewater treatment plant where there's a culture of bugs in the activated sludge that consumes about, it's 82 plus or minus 12% of it. But then we take that sludge, we dewater it, and we land apply it to farms, about 55% of it. And so, we know that crops grown on BPA contaminated soils can uptake bisphenol A. And so that includes leafy vegetables, root crops, and cereal grains.
In an ideal world, I think we would get rid of all the plastics that there are. But that's pretty much impossible the way we're going right now. I mean, just about everything is made from plastic. I think there are certain plastics that are worse than others. We need to get rid of the ones that are really bad. There's certain places where it makes sense to use plastic, maybe in medical situations and for sterility purposes or something like that. But there's a lot of times that we use plastic that just makes absolutely no sense. Picking up our groceries, buying toys wrapped in, boxes wrapped in plastic. I mean, what's the point of something like that? There's lots of times that we're using plastic, particularly single-use disposable plastic, makes absolutely no sense. And we need to start rethinking the way we're doing things like that.